dia.
Bom dia.
My name is Silas Rodrigues Pinto. I am the son of Belmira Vega Rodrigues and Alceu Pinto from the Cape Verdean Islands, which is in the west coast of Africa, those wonderfully dangling islands right off of Senegal, about 400-500 miles away. And I've been here in the United States since 1989. When I first came, my brother and I bounced around in different places. We lived in Baltimore, Maryland, and then eventually in North Dartmouth, Massachusetts, and then moved again to Providence. My brother and I in 6th grade were getting death threats. We were the only two that looked like us. We were the only two in the school that didn't speak English. And so my parents literally got into an altercation, let's call it, with the other family, the kids that were threatening our lives. And eventually, I think that made a big part, decision to move away and just come into a different place. When we got to Providence, you can imagine the difference, the diversity that was here. And I tell the story often of finding myself at Roger Williams Middle School in the hallway, and for the first time, excited because I could hear different sounds, different languages, and I'm like, I think that's that Asian language that I heard about in Cape Verde, and that definitely is Spanish, and I think that might be something like French, or whatever other language you were floating around. And then I went into the classroom, super excited, and learned very quickly that it's okay to speak your language out in the hallway and in the street or at home, but it wasn't welcome in the classroom. So, needless to say, I became a bit of a behavior problem very quickly because I asked a lot of questions. I'm still a pretty intense person. I don't apologize for that. And at the end of the day, I think it's seeds that were planted from the very beginning. We went to school late in Dartmouth. So the first encounter with my teacher, well, first of all, the first question she asked me was, "What are you?" I kid you not. This is 1990, not 1970s. And I didn't even know what they were trying to ask. What are you? That was really a question I couldn't get my head around. And I think they were trying to ask about my race or maybe ethnicity or something like that. I'm not sure because I've never had that conversation again. So I'm only speculating now. But we also came into school in October. And in October, there was the story of Columbus that was introduced. Now, at that point, I'm 12, 13 years old, and I'm thinking to myself, this is not the story I heard. And so I asked a lot of questions, became a behavior problem. Then soon after the Columbus Day ordeal, here comes Thanksgiving. So I just really jammed my foot into my mouth, trying to make sure that I don't get kicked out of school in 6th grade. Go over to my parents and, I get the typical story of just, keep your head down, it's okay, you're gonna hear a lot of lies. You just have to figure out a way to navigate this. I say this story to let you know this is what has been a top of mind since I've been here in this country. I wasn't accepted virtually anywhere, and even when I came to Providence, lots of diversity, and then I heard that same question again, now from peers. What are you? Well, what do you mean? Where are you from? Cape Verde. Oh, you're black. Sure, I guess. That's what they will call us here, and that's how they racialize here, but I'm Cape Verde. And those are the people that came from, at least for the last 500 years, because we were also under colonial rule from Portugal. So this has just been an ongoing thing in my life, an ongoing theme. I decided to go into law to try to study about family law and civil law, and then I took a very sharp left onto psychology towards self-understanding, and I've stayed there ever since, but colonial studies has always been the thread. I ended up teaching at Tufts University for the Department of Education, 12 years before I came into this new position now. I shouldn't call it a new position, it's really a different area in government. I am the interim director and inaugural director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging. and now serving as Deputy Chief of People and Culture for Providence, and it's a brand new reconstruction. We're very new, we're about a month and a little bit old. So I'm sort of in between those things and in transitions like most of my life, and learn how to navigate that. So I give you this here as we go into this. I want you to think about this from a different framework. One, it's about colonization and the ongoing impacts of colonization. This time we're going to land a helicopter on English and then talk about one of the things that I found. When I became the director and started the department in January of 2022, that's how young that department is. It's the youngest department in the city of Providence. We started doing listening tours. We did roundtables. We wanted to hear from folks. What do you need to know? What do you need support around? And I expected, to be honest, that race and gender would jump to the very top of that list, especially in 2022, after all the things that happened in 2020, 2021, George Floyd, and the whole country getting grabbed by its throat, etc. But it didn't. What I kept hearing over and over again were issues around language and language access. That came up to the top. Race, class, gender, sexuality, definitely in the top 5. So for the last 2.5 years or so, and I have one of my colleagues here, Monet Reese, who works as the DEEB coordinator for the city, we've been trying to bring this kind of work into the different departments to raise awareness about language, because as you know, language is a lot more complex, and language access is not just the fact that you speak another language. If you're in a hosting culture, you need access to that, and you need to also feel like you can speak your language, and folks should have some respect for what you bring to the table. And that what you bring to the table is crucial to being able to make transitions. What I'm going to talk about today is going to be a lot based on Spanish and other Latin-based languages, only because of the demographics of Providence, and I was asked to share a bit about the work that I'm doing. But also I'm going to ask you to think about how it then relates with this framework to other languages. So today we're talking about a relational model to bridging communication. So as I go through this, I know that many people in the audience, including our scholar over here, are familiar with things around language. All of us speak a language. We've had experience with language. I'm not trying to tell you what to think about language. So as we go through, I want you to think about what's squaring with you, like what's aligning with what you already know, what's making sense, what's resonating. But then also think about what's being provided that brings a different angle or perspective on what we're talking about. And then lastly, what kinds of questions are circling in your mind? Right? At any point, feel free to lean over someone and be like, here's my circle, here's my square. Am I too far? It's moving very slowly. So let's do it this way. Okay, let's start with some notions about language. Folks, what is the hardest language in the world to learn? What have you heard?
Finnish. Chinese.
Finnish, Chinese. Mandarin. English. I certainly heard that. When I was in elementary, that was one of the things I was told. I knew all of Michael Jackson's songs, by the way. I could speak English. Language and music is beautiful because through music you can learn the sounds of the language. I go to the powwows and I can sing along. I have no idea how to put the sentences together. But I can try to replicate the sounds, right? So I heard that English was like the hardest language to learn. Like, good luck. English and Cape Verdean have nothing in common, so you're in for a surprise. That was the message. But what if I told you there's no such thing as the hardest language in the world to learn? That there is no people in the world whose language is too hard for them to learn. Does that make sense? That you cannot have a language that's too hard for its own people to learn. If we can agree on that, then it must be about transitions, right? It must be about going from one language to another. Because a 5th grader in Japan is speaking at the same level as a 5th grader in South Africa and in Kenya. But going from one language to another, that's the trick. Because just like us, languages have family trees. And if you're jumping from one family tree to another, especially if they're really far removed from each other and developed in very different ways, that's going to be a challenge. I would presume that on that philosophy, going from Spanish to Portuguese is not going to be very challenging, or at least not as challenging as going from Spanish to Arabic, or from Arabic to Japanese, or from Japanese to Yoruba, because they lived in such distances, right, separated by mountains and rivers and oceans. So that's one of the things I want us to think about. How about this idea of languages evolving? We like to think that languages grow, that they get better. If evolve is grow and get better, then I'm going to push back against that and say, nah, language just changes. And it's hard for us to accept that things just change. They don't necessarily get better. And even with English, and I'm saying this because everyone in this room, I presume, speaks English or understands it, that then today, we speak way better than Shakespeare, for example. That's 400 years better. Wouldn't that make sense? That wouldn't make sense. And it's comparing like apples and some other fruit. Because it doesn't just keep moving in one direction. What happens with language is peoples come into contact with other peoples who speak other languages, and by virtue of that contact, the language change. And I'll give you a couple of examples as we go through. So that's one of the notions that I'm challenging here. And we'll come back to this thing about broken English, which I'm sure many of us have heard. And let me get you doing a quick little exercise. So we have 2 paragraphs here that I would like for you to translate. Now, how many of you here speak or have studied the Cape Verdean language? So the reason why I bring that up is twofold. One, I speak the Cape Verdean language. That's one that I'm very familiar. It's my first language. It's my favorite language. I'm not supposed to have favorites or something. That's my favorite language. And I can play with it because it's something that I grew up with. Right? English was my 4th language. And so I'm still trying to figure out this thing. So I apologize if I'm working in circles in any way. But what I would like for you to do, given that you don't know the Cape Verdean language, there's no expectation you're going to get this right, but I would like for you to try anyway, okay? I want you to just turn to the person next to you, this side of the room, you two, and if you can come over to Dr. Weed here, and if you'd like to join someone in the back, you guys on this side are going to translate the red, okay? And then y'all in the middle here, you're going to translate the blue. I'm going to give you 2 minutes. Are you ready? Set, go.
Well, I don't see a single word there that I'm familiar with.
President.
Pardon me?
President.
Presidente. Okay.
Silas. That's it.
Yeah.
That's like
About 30 seconds.
to what? Conversation about different pretenses.
Remember that getting full credit for this conference means getting this right.
But I'm guessing, sure.
Okay. Sorry, folks, we don't have okay. So, let me start with the folks who are translating the red. What is that about? What did you read about? You read about me. What about me?
Your professional development and your like, is your mission statement sort of?
Okay, so can you read it? Can you translate for me?
No.
No. Okay. How about the folks in the middle who would like to go? Okay, well, okay, I see someone being voluntold. Come on. So, go ahead.
Do you want
Yeah, just go ahead and translate it. Best your ability.
Similar to other professionals and directors of administration, Mayor Smiley and Providence, Rhode Island, Silas is interested in discussions about literacy and inclusion.
That's the right here.
Today we will be discussing objectives of colleges in supervision. These intentions in utilizing principles of justice in all dimensions, aspects of these departments, specialties, areas, cultural sensitivity.
So this is someone who has never studied the language.
We worked on that together, let me just say.
Have you studied the language? Have you studied the language?
No, but we-
Okay, just say. But these are folks, I'll say folks then, okay? These are folks that have never studied the language. And yet, they can translate that. And what if I tell you that these two saying the exact same thing? They're the same exact language from the same exact town. Okay? They're Chada Santo Antonio in Praia, Santiago, Cape Verdean Islands. I gave you the neighborhood where it is coming from. Same language. All I did was think about who's going to be reading it. Instead of, well, how good am I going to sound, is who's reading it. Isn't that the purpose of communication? But we have been to too many meetings where people just love the way they sound. And not about people understanding, because you have to speak in a way so that you're understood, and you also have to speak in a way so that you're not misunderstood. At least we try, right? And then this is about intentionality. They're saying the same thing. So instead of professionals, which I know you could understand and see it, I used profis, because we do use that. Instead of supervisor, supervisor, which you can see when it's in writing, I used chefs, which is your chief, a person who supervises you, and so on. The key I want you to keep in mind is that if you understood anything, is because I was keeping you as the audience in mind. The reason why this happens in the United States is because we don't ask questions about how did Dochter become daughter? How did Knecht become knight? How did Huat become what? And why do they still say Huat in England and Dochter in like Scotland? It came from somewhere. We have forgotten history. In the United States, we purposely teach through this dimension, the scientific approach. The scientific approach, the science of language. Let's break it down into a million pieces. Let's break it down into morphemes and phonemes and diacritics and syntax, and let's teach you about the importance of spelling from day one. You're in kindergarten, I'm teaching you 10. You better get it right in the spelling. You know, these are all the things that make you really dislike language. Did you know that? This is the things that really make people move away from language. And the reason why I can predict with almost 95% accuracy that if you're born and raised in an English-only household, you will never speak another language fluently in your life. How is that an accident? That if you're teaching in our schools another language, you brought it here or you learned it from home. At the very least, your foundation is there. Then you went to school to polish it up so you can teach it through the curriculum that's been set by here. But those students taking your classes, chances are, they'll take it for 4, 5, 10, 15 years and can't do it. That is not an accident. On the other side of this continuum, which is, I'm going to say the word because it's on there. So most people here are familiar with linguistics. You've heard of it. How many of you have heard linguistics? Okay. How many of you have heard philology? You have to be a linguist or someone studying language to know what philology is. And then what we've done, the European nations have actually thrown it into this thing that's about historical documents, and that's that. And hide it from everyday folks. But on that other side is philology, which is the relational way of thinking about language. This is where the family trees are. Linguists also borrow from that work. They don't always make a whole lot of meaning out of it for you, but they know it exists. This is where history is. This is where bridging communication is. This is a framework. This is about mindset. This is about shifting. Now, if you're already a person who speaks multiple languages, fantastic. Some of us had to study really hard for it. But this is also about access of other folks into, say, English. because I struggled with English like you wouldn't believe. My dad spoke 7 languages before he came here and then hit a brick wall with English. And many of us have that story. Family members that have been trying to speak English for the last 20, 30 years. And it's just like, they just can't do it. Why? Because English is one of the hardest languages in the world. Lies. Okay, so let me move on from here. This brings me to my favorite word in the English language, which is the title of this presentation. And how would you read that word?
Fish.
Fish. Now, that's because it's not hidden, you see. We know about what happens with English. And the reason why it's fish is a son wrote to his dad in 1824 and said, "Hey Dad, I just figured out another way to spell fish. And that's the F in enough, the in women, and the sh in nation, fish." If you really want to make an impression, you should just keep dropping that in text every once in a while and let them try to figure it out. But we don't walk around spelling it this way. But how did that happen is the question. How did that happen? Anyone? It happened because of 300 years of colonization in England. That's how it happened. And we don't talk about it. We have literally hundreds of millions of dollars that have been spent over years and years and decades to make sure that you never talk about English in this particular way. Most of us learned about the Norman conquest of 1066. Yeah? Yeah. And then what happened? Nothing happened. They just came in. And that's it. Colonizers come into a land and things just get better. Isn't that the lesson? This is why we don't know of what's happened to English and the opportunities, the bridging that can happen as a result. Let me just put things in perspective, okay? The first king of England to have English as his first language was Henry IV. The first king of England to have any law written in English in England is Henry V. And who's Henry V? He's the person that won the 100-year war against France for English independence. That ring a bell for some folks? I see some nods. Yeah. So what does that mean for language? It means that the Normans brought French to England. All of the people of England, upon that conquering by William the Conqueror, became peasants. All of the elites spoke French, and only French, because that's all they knew. In fact, what's interesting about it in this conversation of colonization and the cycle of oppression is that the Normans were also a Germanic people. They had their own language, and then France went over there, conquered them, left them with French. So what was brought over into England was a version of French. And today, because over 300 years, you had French speakers in England with two different sort of dialects, if you will, a lot of that is now left in the English that we know today. In fact, when you think about English, try to think about the original Germanic peoples in that area's language was Anglo-Saxon. To this day, we still actually talk about English. And in the modern age, internet age, it's thriving, folks. People are trying to go back towards stripping English, this English, of its Latin influences from that colonization. So today you'll see, for example, I'll give you an example. Guerre. Guerre in French is war. Guerre, right? Or guerre in Cape Verdean language. So there's the family. But when it went to the Normans, they couldn't really say the G sound, so it became where, and then eventually were, and then war. You have things like warranty and guarantee. Guarantee, Parisian French influence, warranty, the other French influence. Things like catch and chase, so on and so forth. Lots and lots of examples where the two were having an influence in England for 300 years. And it's not just that, you see, because the English people used to grow and eat cow. But when it got to the French table, it became bœuf. So what do you eat now, English peasants? You eat bœuf, and it eventually becomes beef. You grow swine, the Scandinavian variation, pig. But when it got to the French table, it becomes pork. Why? Because that's what they call the animal. But what are you eating today now, English peasants? We gotta sound and be more like the French, so I guess we're eating pork. We're not gonna be eating pigs anymore. And everything that was French was better. You have schools, we have université. You have teacher, we have professeur. You take rides, ride, we transport. You talk or speak, we communicate. You pick it up what I'm putting down. And this is thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of words of influence. And today, French and Latin make up almost 70% of what we call English. And what a connection to all of the Germanic languages, because that's the foundation of English, which is why I can talk to you right now using only English words, or I can opt to communicate with you utilizing primarily French vocabulary, and all of a sudden I sound like a professeur. But until then, I just sound like a typical person, right? This is what was instilled for those hundreds of years. And this is where I live very often. This is a somewhat consolidated one. This is all from the Proto-Indo-European, reconstructed languages of thousands of years ago. But it is said that Proto-European had these children, the ones that we're going to focus on, these two. The italic that eventually became Latin, and Latin had these particular children. On the other side, you had Germanic that had all of those, and this is the path for English, or I should say, Anglo-Saxon. English, as some of the folks have been saying it, since about 1966. Now, why is that important? Why 1966? Someone decided to start visiting this conversation at the 900th year of the Norman Conquest, to start this conversation about what has happened to their language. And on the other side, you have what's happened after the Norman Conquest, what then eventually became Middle English, and then Modern English, and then what we speak today, Late Modern English or Contemporary. We have people in high school, folks, that still believe that Shakespeare is Old English. We have adults who've been told that Shakespeare is Old English. Shakespeare is Modern English. And Shakespeare existed 100 years after Modern English started. Just to put a pin for us, Hamlet was written in 1600. That's your marker, right? But look at the irony, right? Maybe not so much irony, maybe just look at the connection. In 1616 is when they published Shakespeare's 38 plays. Some say 36, so somewhere between that, right? 1616. 1611, the King James Version of the Bible is published. 1611, this is the third translation of the Bible to English. And then shortly after that, 1619, 1620, what happens? They're here. What do they bring with them? King James Version of the Bible and Shakespearean plays. In fact, our whole education system, as far back as the very first school, Boston Latin still teaches within this framework, hundreds of years later, because that's what they had. It's kind of like me and my 1990s music, you know. You can't tell me it's not the best. You can't tell my parents that 1970s music is not the best, because that's what you had, and it just gets passed down. And my kids love Michael Jackson, not because they heard it in the radios, because I played it from the time they were like whatever years old. I just appreciate his music, and many others. And it gets passed down intergenerationally. Next thing you know, you have me listening to folks that are far removed. Why? Because my grandmother listened to them and taught me how to appreciate the music. Brings me to things like this. It brings me back to when I was 12 years old and my teacher's telling me, Cape Verdean in English, sorry, no connection, good luck. Really? Maybe lack of knowledge of the history. And I've also met people who have the knowledge and then are no longer ignorant, but they're ignorant. Because ignorance is something that we all have. I am ignorant about a lot of things. I am far from a perfect person, and I'm far from a knowledgeable person. I stand next to my grandparent, I always feel like a grandchild, right? I have a lot to learn, it's all good. But once I come into some new information, I gotta figure out how to try to weave it into my being. I don't have to get it perfect, but that I'm in the process of trying to implement it in some way. But then for me, once you start to actively go on the journey of ignoring it, now it's ignorance, not ignorance. We have lost ignora in the word ignorance. To know that that's one way of not knowing. There are different ways of not knowing. Ignorance is one, which is to not know. But the information is available, you just haven't come into contact with it. And then there's nescience, which is also an English word, N-E-science. Nescience, no science, which means there's no science to be had for you to know anything about it. Very different to not know words. But you can see here the influence and the connection. So English is a historical language, folks. We cannot teach it through phonetic means. You have to look at the history, and the history is painful. The history has a lot about colonization. And we know what happens when you live in conditions of colonization. Many people then internalize it as some kind of truth. And then when you finally have to look back, it's a lot to unpack, and you're like, nah, we're not doing that. This brings me to the conversation of a Creole language. Now, I didn't put you through that experience where I say, how many of us here speak a Creole language? And people, I don't know, who does? Anybody? And I'm like, all of us speak the Creole language. But why don't we call English a Creole language? Well, why would you want to put it down there with the rest of the Creoles of the world? English doesn't belong there. It's a superior language. Why would you want to put it with Patois and Cape Verde and Haitian? Why would you want to do that? And that's a problem, because then it's a huge missed opportunity to really connect and look at languages for what they are. They're not hierarchical. Languages just exist, but they come from families. And we miss the opportunity. English is connected to like a dozen languages easily. And we have people at the federal government, when we become an ambassador, I can prepare you to go to Switzerland and Norway, Germany, Holland, like this. To Portugal and Spain and to Senegal, like this. I can prepare you in 24 weeks. But we don't have that knowledge coming down into our schools. So let me talk about Creole real second. It's a little bit different than the delicious bird, what we call pigeon, right? Not that pigeon, don't get it confused. This is P-I-D-J-I-N, pigeon. It's a temporary language when two powers come together. And then they have to come up with a temporary set of rules, if you will, to understand each other. You've heard about the Roman Empire? Yeah, I'm assuming. The Roman Empire just came across Europe and just started devastating everything, right? Just taking over teaching people their language, and they had the ability to do it. Then they went across the Mediterranean, they came and they were like, Egypt. Not a second. Apologies. We thought it was someone else. So let's talk. But we can understand each other. So can we come up with some set of rules? Like, like what do you call this? Microphone, right? You? How much? How much for this, right? And you come up with a list of rules and you trade for a little while and then the language disappears. Because there's no need for it once you come apart. Because it was an agreement between the two of you. Creoles don't come from that. Creole comes from one condition, colonization. And that is when you have a power sitting on top of a subjugated peoples, and what is squeezed out, if there's another language, is a language that is based on the vocabulary of the dominant and everything else of the subjugated. All of the rhythm, all of the sounds, or mispronunciations, whatever you want to call it, are from the other folks. This is how participation became participation. Good enough. Why? Because the French-speaking people had no interest in making you, peasant, a scholar of their language. Portuguese weren't trying to make Yoruba people and Dongo people, Bantu people, and Cape Verde a scholar of Portuguese. Milieu. Miju? Good enough. Entrance. Entrance? Good enough. Préférence. Preference? Good enough. And here we are, hundreds of years later, still making fun of how other people sound, which is wild to me. Wild to me. And that says that we, at least at this point, are ignorant about this history. Now, how do we move forward? Are we moving into ignorance? Or are we going to work with this knowledge? Because when people come here, or people who've been solidly in their language for whatever amount of time and they're trying to transition, they can't pronounce the words properly, and then we start bashing them because they don't sound right. This is where this comes from. Just about all the words coming out of our mouths, folks, are pretty much mispronunciations of French, 70% of it at least. That vocabulary of the dominant, everything else of the subjugated. This happens everywhere. If you're in Haiti, I see Director Alpert in the house over here. Thank you for coming. I think that's you. I have lights right on my face, it's bright. But I think that's you. If you're coming from Haiti, you know, your vocabulary is based on French, and everything else is based on all of the folks that were subjugated, from Yoruba people to the Taino folks that were around, etc., etc. If you're in Cape Verde, your language is based on Portuguese vocabulary, everything else. And in many cases, you may even say that if you come out with a Creole, you may be fortunate, because in many places you weren't even allowed. They're going to teach you exactly like Martinique. We're going to teach you exactly, and then you come out like France Fanon, actually believing you're a French person, until you go to France and they go, oh, they don't quite treat me like a French person all of a sudden. Yeah? I do this exercise as an example, right? How would you describe this to a 5-year-old? I'm stealing this from Denzel Washington in Philadelphia. How would you describe this to a 5-year-old?
A home cook versus a chef.
Which one is the home cook? The one on the left.
Apron.
Anything else? Which one's the professional? And this is exactly what's still going on. That we believe that it's still okay to go and pay significantly more for cuisine at a restaurant with food prepared by a chef than to have food at a tavern with a cook. And what is that? That's just French and Germanic, Anglo-Saxon. And that kind of social piece, I'm not going to use another word that's in my mind, is still lingering with us. Because again, just as I gave an example of being able to talk to you using Anglo-Saxon words, and then I flip it over and I'm communicating using French vocabulary all of a sudden, right? And so it's still around because people, you can go to meetings and they'll just throw a French word in there. And it sounds just marvelous, yeah? Merveilleux. Just sounds beautiful. And it's almost in your DNA. Did you know that that kind of trauma is in your DNA? Did you know that that lives in our bodies? It does. It's not an accident that a lot of humans are just afraid of spiders. Something happened to somebody down the line. The fact that what my grandmother tells me about her stories as practically an indentured servant, and I feel it in my body, that's not an accident. It's in us. And then also there's the social aspect, which was interesting when I was trying to figure out, as an immigrant here, immigrante here, why do they keep saying pardon my French when they're being rude? I wonder if it has anything to do with stuff like that. So, I'll start to, well actually, we're ahead of schedule, which is fantastic. We're ahead of schedule, yes. How many of us have heard of Bix and Kelp? It's there. If you're, I'm a school psychologist by trade. Told you I went into psychology, took that sharp left, and then I got lost somewhere. But I did find school psychology. And this is when I first learned of it. Oh, it exists in English. Yeah, this is the way that English is organized. Well, who gets to know about this? People who are struggling with learning English, and people who have some kind of speech pathology and other kinds of issues like that. And this is when you come across it. This is basic interpersonal communication skills and cognitive academic language proficiency. I'm going to tell you a little story. In the 1970s, let me ask this here. When did U.S. members of the U.S. country, begin having a right to a formal education in the United States? When did that happen? So, 1975 comes out, technically 1970 comes out, a Handicapped Children's Act that just bombed. And then in 1975, they came out with the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act. That was reauthorized in 1990, 1997, and 2004 as Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Amendments Act. Right? That's the most recent one of 2004. That's the setting, 70s. In the 70s, children were being basically ignored. Their education completely inadequate because they didn't know English. And so in 1974, there was a case called Lau v. Nichols. And at the Supreme Court level, they mandated that learning English is a civil right. We gave all a right to an education in 1986 when we amended that 1975 Act to include birth to 5. So we are literally kind of babies, at least toddlers, in this work compared to the rest of the world. And making it very hard for us to connect and to look and to learn from others. But that's the 1974. I bring this up for context to point out that this framework was created in 1979 by Jim Cummins. Now, we have schools that have been built for many, many, many moons, right? All the way into maybe, some records show into the 1670s, and then 1820s. And we made schooling mandated in 1898, I believe. It was in the 1890s. And it was to have children stay at home longer into their biological adulthood so that they can support industrial revolution and learning machines. And then English and math became the primary thing, reading instructions and then basic math so you can do the work on machinery. Now, that sounded wonderful in the 1890s to do that, but we had been around with children for a very long time, and then suddenly they became useful to us. In fact, my profession, school psychology, started in 1905. 1905. Why? Using French batteries, as they call them, testing batteries, cognitive batteries, that were prepared for teachers by this guy named Alfred Binet. He was interested in sort of understanding where students were, and then here in the United States in 1916, and I'm throwing these dates out just so you can see how new a lot of this is. 1916, in Stanford, Lewis Terman does the translation of that, and we start sorting children. You know who one of the first ones to use the intelligence test? Military in World War I. To separate alphas from betas, who's going to be in the front line and die, and who's going to become the engineers and the pilots, etc. We did that. None of this is a mystery. It's all history that's very available to us. Okay? But we don't care to bring this and create this system to support immigrants learning English until 1979, and by someone that used linguistics, and by someone that had very little understanding of where other people were coming from. So he looked at it and he did a great job with just looking at it and saying, through the linguistic lens, this is what English is now. Which is why we don't really ask about where it came from. And that's really the work of linguistics. But I want to break this down further to tell you that what this means is that you're going through a phase. In the early phases when you're teaching immigrants and the young kids, they're learning the basic interpersonal communication skills. I mean, what else do they need, right? And then you have the cognitive academic language proficiency, which is cognitive academic language proficience. Oh, what does that mean about this part right here? Well, this is what it's saying. Basic interpersonal communication skills, Germanic base, French vocabulary and Latin. And what we're talking about there is your SATs. You remember those? French vocabulary. So if you're coming from a language where Germanic is your base, Latin's going to be a little bit challenging, and vice versa. So the question is, who does this serve? We have children here in Providence coming from the Dominican Republic. Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, they're already in this cognitive academic language proficiency because the words of French are Spanish. If it's Spanish, it's Italian. If it's Italian, it's Portuguese. It's Romanian, it's Cape Verdean, it's practically Haitian. But no matter when you come in as an immigrant, we're going to start you with basic interpersonal communication skills. You're coming in with Germanic and I'm going to give you German. So I came in with Latin-ish language. Obviously we know how we got there, but that's what I came in with, that's my language. And you're going to start me with speaking English is hard, instead of communicating in English is difficult, because comunica en difícil is already in my language. What's the reason for doing that? Who does that serve? And who does it not? Who does it hurt? Who does it continue to hurt? And then they have this thing called the silent period, which I like to call the shaming period, especially for immigrants when they come in and people go silent. It's not because they're like just going into receptive mode. They're just getting tired of people completing their sentences, correcting them constantly on the way that they sound without any permission. The impatience in the room, the looks that you get, all kinds of things that happen to immigrant population. It happens to people who live and have lived here for thousands of years, and now they're trying to learn English. The same thing happens to them as well. Because we have this impatience. We think we know, and we've not been introduced to our history. That shaming period is also important to highlight, and it doesn't exist in language acquisition, folks. It doesn't exist. That's my argument. Here's why I can tell you that. Because I've raised quite a few children, and in that toddlerhood, they don't go silent. There's no going silent. Once you stop babbling, it's over. It's just going to move from there. But all of a sudden, for immigrants learning a language, they go into a silent period. And because it's normalized as a silent period, teacher, just leave him alone. He's going through something very normal right now. Silent period. Don't even ask about how they're feeling about all this. Just let them stay in the corner. This is a little table to show you. This is the Foreign Service Institute that exists at the federal level. Yes, our tax dollars goes to this, 1,300 workers. And they know about this. This is how they prepare. This is just to show you the table, not to mention that they have full curriculum to prepare you. Again, if Chief Two Hawks right now decided to become an ambassador to Japan, they're like, Japanese is very far from this particular tree. You're looking at approximately 88 weeks to get prepared, and I can get you to go there and speak with confidence. But here's an additional thing. Not only can you just do that, because if you're an ambassador, you can have a geographic marker, which we call accents, right? People will know you're not native Japanese. But did you know that we can train people to eliminate their accents? Spies have no choice but to have perfect, right? And not only that, it has to be specific to the region where they say they were born and raised. Imagine me coming from Cape Verde as a spy, yeah? And I'm saying, yeah, I was born in Texas, but I sound like I'm from, say, Florida. That's my persona. Or I was born in the Northeast in Boston, but I sound like a Texan because that's the English they taught me. Do you know what's going to happen to me? So it has to be to that level of perfection. It just hasn't trickled down to our schools and into our community. So I wanted to highlight this for you because a couple of things. These are what English is already related to in that first category. German, it's in its own because supposedly its vocabulary and grammar, more specifically, is a little bit more challenging apparently. And I don't know enough German and Dutch to sort of do that separation, but that's how they've now created a separate category for it, and it's in a category of its own. But what does Afrikaans, Danish, Dutch, Norwegian, and Swedish have in common?
Germanic?
They're all Germanic languages. And what does French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, Spanish, Cape Verdean, Haitian have in common? They're Latin. And so it's saying that you can go from English to these languages like that. Yeah? Now, I want to pause here for a second to say that I know that I'm talking a little bit about vocabulary and vocabulary connections, and we know that when you come from a separate family tree, it may not be vocabulary, right? So some of the indigenous languages here, some of the indigenous languages of Asia, they don't have vocabulary similarities, but guess what? They may be similar at the structural level. I'll give you an example. Did you know that Germanic languages are mono and bisyllabic? One syllables, two syllable words. How many people knew that? How many people picked up on that? And that if it's more than two, they're compound words. So, speak, talk, door, way, ham, burger. And you can just do that for fun, like catch, right? 1, 2 syllables, that's the way the language developed because that's what they enjoyed. That's it. But Latin enjoyed multiple syllables. So speak, comunique. Ride, transporte. Door, way, intense. Choice, préférence. See what I'm saying? So when you think about it from that angle, and you have languages from here, if you're in Providence, you know that if you go up Broad Street, that's driving right into the Dominican Republic. If you go over to Elmwood Avenue, and you start going down that line, you're going into Southeast Asia. If we're communicating to these communities, they have to be different, especially in writing, for immigrant populations, not those who already have the command of English or something like that. But if you have a language, whether it's an indigenous one here, or from, say, Vietnam, where their language is also mono and bisyllabic, When they come here, what do you think they will gravitate towards? Germanic. And when I sit down with these families and I can hear them using Germanic words. The problem is that society has said, well, if you're only using Germanic words, that sounds less educated. Why? Because for 300 years, French people were telling the English that they were less than, that their language was not as important. And that still exists today. It should not be, again, in the hierarchy, but rather putting languages side by side. So I'm just going to give a quick little here. This is the reason why it's so important for me to continue doing it through the Latin-based component. In Rhode Island, 80% of the non-English languages spoken are Latin-based. And then you come into Providence, and you learn that 94% of our languages are interconnected. And yet, our students are failing English like you wouldn't believe in school. And it's not like we don't know why. I think we can know why. We have the information, but we haven't done the paradigm shift that we need to do. Just to give you a couple of examples, I like to give this example because it's probably most poignant. Working with school psychologists, I tend to pull information from their report as a way of helping them. So I say, who's your audience? And they go, this particular family, I'm trying to figure out a way to connect with them. They immigrated from the Azorian Islands, which speaks Portuguese, or from Haiti, and they speak French, and not quite there with the English yet. And what they're being told, including myself, was that you need to bring it down, right? So that the immigrant can understand, or this new learner of English can understand. But when you bring it down, you're bringing it to German, and if that person speaks Portuguese, which is a Latin base, you're making it completely alien to them. If a person's coming from Holland or Norway, bringing it not down, but just modifying it to have English words reflected or English words reflected is going to make better sense for them. And so here's some examples. I'm sorry, I should mention one other thing. Here's my rationale, right? This is 2017. This is the National Association of School Psychologists. They did the survey and they learned that 86% of our school psychologists are fluent in only English. That's not surprising. If you go to different countries, that's probably going to be the case, right? That their native language is the language that's predominantly spoken if they don't know another one. So it's not my goal at this point to make everyone multilingual. Right? I think there's no replacement for speaking other languages. Like, I still dream in my language, and I love my language. And that's important to me. And I love learning about other languages. I love asking people to teach me the way that they express things. I love singing along with the songs of this region because I just appreciate that, right? But that's not my goal, to come and bring that over to folks who haven't thought about it. But what I am trying to do is get them to even just use their English to bridge communication to other populations. By knowing their history, by not putting English in a pedestal and understanding it's just the language of the world. And it has experiences, and it has its history, and it has its relationships. So here are some examples. I think this one here was written to one of those families from, trying to remember this one here. I think it's a family from the Azorian Islands, Portuguese speaker, and they brought it way down, and they're like, Silas was given a task, it wasn't Silas by the way. Silas was given a task that asked him to put blocks and all of that. That one right there in particular, a task that asked. A task that asked. That is very Germanic, folks. And when you look at African Americans, for example, right here, that had Yoruba tongues. Ghanaian, people that were part of the Ghana Empire, they're at least in part Yoruba. When they came here, they couldn't say things like asked. So they say asked. It's called a metathesis. And that's just how the language bridged. And when that was happening, it wasn't like trying to correct it. It was like that. I think you understand what I'm trying to say. Good, keep going. That's what happened to the language. And now they say asked. That's it. Old English word for bird was brid. Old English for thunder was tanor. Those metastases happen naturally. Kids run around saying pasgetti instead of spaghetti. Very naturally, no one taught them pasgetti. But they say it because of that little switch, right? So this is very German. But look at the difference between that and Silas was administrado, séries, questão, acessado, habilidade, verbal, resequência, informação, apresentado, reverse ordem. And if you are a Spanish speaker, like our friend Ahaya Joveles here in the front, he can see Spanish. He can see it. I guarantee it. He can see it. If you're Italian, you can see it. If you speak French in Senegal, you can see it. But that one up there will look foreign to you. But will work really great for those other ones that I told you about. Here's another one. Silas fell within the expected level for his peers in a task that asked him to put a series of pictures in order ranged from very easy to very hard. Germanic, beautiful, beautiful. It's Germanic, it's beautiful. But who is it serving? Who is it bridging communication with? On the other side you have comparado, estudantes, Silas, classe, habilidade, formulado, integrado, visual, apresentado, informação, área, relativo, vulnerabilidade. These are all words that are just in the language. But they won't start you here because you're an immigrant. Because you're a new English speaker. And my mother still lives in Cape Verde, but if she came here for 6 months and learned to, from, is, and, of, and is, she will be able to read that sentence with no problem. Speaking it is going to take time because that's a muscle issue. Right? Something like presented, because we would say presentado. So switching that around will take some time. So in summary, I'm going to just try to land a helicopter on a couple of things that we could be doing. Number one, all of us can begin by contextualizing English within its proper sort of framework, which is historical. I'll give you an example here, which is that we've lost some things in English. Anglo-Saxon had conjugations. They had gender. You could see a lot of it living in that modern English of Shakespeare when he's referring to candlesticks as he, because that's what it was, right? It had formal and informal, like all of the other European languages. If you're in Portuguese, it's tu and vós. If it's in French, it's tu and vous. If it's in Spanish, it's tu and usted, etc., etc. And the way you speak to a grandparent is not the way you speak to your friends. Cape Verdeans have that as well. English had that. And it got lost when that third translation of the Bible happened in 1611. Before then, thou is singular, one, informal, and eu, or you, is plural. But by making the decision that Christians needed to say, we are talking about a singular God, they could no longer use you. That was in the previous translations. They started using thou to symbolize singular God. And everyone became plural after that. We stopped using thou for each other and just use you, which is why it's still you are, because are is for plural. And thou art, that would have been the is back then. That got lost. I'm telling the story because many, many moons later, people come together because that's how languages change. And people came together, English speakers, with folks down in Florida, now what we call Florida, with Spanish speakers, into Louisiana with French speakers. And they were like, you know, we really would love to bring some of this back. You know, this like formal, informal is a really good idea. And so down there they started using things like you is and y'all are. You is and yous are. And we say, you guys are so wrong. That's so ridiculous. It's so incorrect. Again, not appreciating the reason why languages come into contact and change. Challenge the notion of that calp and bix. Right? You should be thinking about it from who does it serve, not just that English is. But who needs to start with a Germanic and who needs to start with a cognitive academic language proficiency. I always encourage multilingual education. Because especially with English speakers like us here, we already have multiple languages embedded within. Give you an example that you can take as a starting point. Any word that comes out of your mouth that has "shan" at the end, French. Okay? So you can just start by bringing it from the back of your mind to the front and say, when I say, hey, yeah, the participation, yes, the participation. That's French. Okay, I'm speaking another language right now. That's cool, right? Would like to make an introduction, an introduction. Exploration. We're about to do some exploration. All of them. If you might find one or two that are not cool because languages change, but we're talking about thousands and thousands of words. Just that alone. Other ones like words that end in ENCE, ANCE, entrance, préférence, occurrence, etc. Longer words, 3 syllables or more, for the most part, that end in L, international, professional, national, you name it. You already have other languages embedded within. And it could be easy if you're not trying to learn another language, but at least to be cognizant of who you're speaking to so you can make that bridging, like the example that we did at the beginning of this presentation. Lastly, this is more of a plea. I grew up hearing people talk about themselves and their parents and their relatives as speaking broken English. How many of us have heard that, broken English? What I'll say is, we don't say that toddlers walking around speak broken English. They are beginner English. And then you become intermediate English, and then advanced English, and maybe expert English. We do not have the power to break language, but we can break people. And I think that's what is being done with languages. We have weaponized it. And one of the ways that we weaponize it is by keeping the stories from people. And we all know in this room how important that is. We have to keep telling the truth about whatever it is. This is what cultural placemaking is about. It's saying what has happened. It doesn't need to even come with shame necessarily, but we're like, this is the story. And in that land in particular, because that was the land of indigenous peoples, there were Germanic peoples living on their own, doing what they were doing, and then others came because they thought, we can bring something better to you via this channel called colonization and completely destroy. And then you now injure the peoples that were there. They internalize that as truth, and now how can we be surprised when they then go and pass it on to others? Because almost immediately after gaining independence and reestablishing their own country, they started now colonizing others. The English learned it from the French learned it from the Romans, and the story just keeps on going until we decide to break that cycle. Thank you.
A couple of questions before we move on to our next presentation. I see Peter with his hand up.
Hello, Doctor. Fantastic presentation. Question, have you been hearing a lot of examples where people are taking texts or textbooks and throwing them through ChatGPT and saying, give me this in words that are primarily Latin-based or Germanic-based?
Yes, there's a lot of that actually that's happening. It's a matter of coding. But as I mentioned, in this new online world, English is really thriving. So what you can do is just look it up. Just type in Anglo-Saxon English or just English, A-N, the rest is just like English. And you can see that there are communities doing that. They have word books instead of dictionaries, right? Because those are the Germanic words. When Queen Elizabeth passed away, you can see some of those things. If you said, hey, find me a document that just shows this with just English, I think ChatGPT, the AI, will probably do it because it's out there. When the Queen Elizabeth passed away, that group actually wrote a thing all in English, an article, like an obituary of sorts. They said, for example, Queen Elizabeth the Other has passed at the age of, and people like the other. And then when you go back in time, you come to learn that other in Old English was second. Second is So the offspring of, say, Secunda, which is Latin-based. And then when they got to Prince, and talking about the current prince in England, they didn't use prince because prince is a French-derived word. So they use Ethling, because Ethel is the closest that you would get to a noble, and then the ing in Old English makes it smaller. So Ethling would be like little noble, as in prince. Things like that. So absolutely, folks are working really hard to do this work, and it's been happening since the 1966 in particular.
Pinto. In my own field of writing studies, since the 70s, we've had policy documents come out of our professional organizations, things like students' right to their own language. Of course, in practice, we continue to debate this, largely because some folks make the case that if we only empower students to write within their own dialects, then we are disadvantaging them in a world that continues to privilege standard written English, let's say. And I think that ultimately then there's a conversation that has to happen about how do we dismantle some of those structures of racist language ideology that make it challenging for somebody to speak in a dialect other than standard English, or what you might call dominant white English or whatever, and not be judged. And so I guess I'm just curious to hear from you, like, what do you think can be happening, let's say, on a municipal level or in other sort of professional contexts to kind of dismantle those things, other than just personally saying, oh, I'm going to be less culturally and linguistically biased when I see somebody communicate in English that I don't necessarily recognize as the standard.
For me, I think that the last piece that you just said, other than that particular component that you just mentioned, I think that that's really the starting point. Because if I start to change the way that I speak with folks because of my attempt to bridge that communication, folks are going to start wondering why I'm doing that. And then I get to educate, and then we can move people out of that state of sort of ignorance. Because they're going to be judging me, and I have to be willing to be okay with when I'm speaking to someone and all of those Germanic words are coming out, which is the everyday language, and they're like, why is he speaking in that way? And of course, I'm doing it because of the person who's in front of me, right? And that I have to be okay with that kind of judgment, and then engage with those folks over time. Now, the thing that you're talking about is one of those nuances. Once you have learned a language, and you start getting up here, you're like, well, which dialect should we be using? That's a little bit different than what we're talking here in terms of just transitioning and getting a foothold into a language. That being said, English is spoken as an official language in 54 countries. 54. So when people are having conversation about, well, which one should be standard and this and that, I care less about that, unfortunately, because I'm like, you kind of did this, so I don't have much pity for that. Now, in addition to the 54 official languages, which are on countries that are primarily colonized, Ethiopia speaks English, but as we know, that's the one country that was not colonized. There are 4 other countries that speak English as a de facto language. It's just a matter of fact, but it's not the official language. What's one of those countries? The United States. Doesn't have an official language, but we just speak English here. United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand. How ironic is that? How interesting, right? So there are a lot of conversations about sort of the standard and dialects and things of that nature. I'm not really working too much into that region of which one should be standard. Back in the day, it was wherever the king was, you would just follow that. So Anglo-Saxons would sort of, depending on who was taking over with power, people would try to mimic the language of the king. But I think that, personally, that there is a way to still elevate and have expert and advanced English speakers of different dialects, and it comes down to respect. Because once in a while, I still spell color, C-L-O-U-R, on purpose here. right? I spell aluminum instead of aluminum on purpose, you know, just so people understand that this is accepted. Gray and gray, which one do you use? You know, I don't want to get tied in the weeds, and when people see me and my positionality, right, as a person who's a quote-unquote professional, doing that purposely, it's to invite a conversation so we can maybe get some of that done at the interpersonal level.
Take one more. There is one. If not, if the good doctor has
Questions,
supported us
comments,
with
or
his
vicious attacks?
presentation. Well, fantastic, good doctor. Congratulations for your presentation. Thank you for starting our second day off in a very